right. Thank you for joining us this evening for putting King Arthur on the map. So I have with me Professor Molly Martin. She is from the University of Indianapolis, and she is going to present this evening. This program is in part connected with our summer reading program. So our theme is around myths, legend, magic, folk tales. So make sure to sign up for summer reading right now. It's pretty simple. We have it this year. You just need to pick up a slip reading log at the library. You read your 6 books, you turn it back in, and then you collect your completion prize. And we have it for, a completion prize for all ages. Um, Adults will get a bag, a browsing bag, pretty nice tote, take for groceries or any type of shopping or anything you want with it. And then you get a water bottle in it too. And then we have our grand prize adults will be put in where they can get a number of different, I have various gift cards that I'm trying to do with that. But it's pretty simple. Even if you don't want to come in the library, we have a digital form that's available on our website. So we've tried to make it pretty easy this year with everything going on. So as I said, we have Professor Molly Martin with us, and she is going to talk about King Arthur and, of course, then place him on the map for us, which is going to be pretty exciting. There's been so many various movies created around King Arthur. There's a new one currently that's out, which is a different take on the legend. So, pretty exciting things going on. So, I'll go ahead and let you take it away.
Well, thank you so much, and I want to thank Candace. I want to thank the Monticello Public Library for having me. I'm really excited to share. So, just going to take a minute to share my screen. Um, Hopefully, my pictures will keep it interesting. Okay. So before I really jump into the mapping part, I want to give just a brief overview of sort of the legend, um, or how it becomes the legend. It's not a single story, right? So when we have these new versions, that like the one that's out right now on Netflix, Cursed, um, it's constantly productive. It constantly becomes something new, right? So even in the medieval period, the period that I study most closely, it's lots of different stories that come together. It's centuries worth of stories that create this single kind of idea of King Arthur. And the stories come from England, they come from France, they come from across Europe, and then as time goes on, it spreads even further across the globe. They're written in Latin, they're written in Welsh, they're written in English, they're written in French, and then again they sort of burgeon up a little bit. Um, and so as I'm talking, I'm often going to say things like, well, one version of the story, it happens in this place, but that doesn't mean all the versions are in that place or mapped in that way. So if you're familiar with the story and you're like, oh, I thought it was another place, it's probably that place too, actually. I'm just focusing on one because um, they didn't want me to talk for 16 hours about all the places that King Arthur has ever appeared. You probably also don't want me to talk for 16 hours, but feel free to stop by University of Indianapolis sometime and when we're fully open, and I'll be happy to talk for 16 hours. Anyway, I'll be focusing mostly on the British tradition and mostly on the medieval versions, but I'll be occasionally jumping forward a little bit and showing some things that are a bit more modern. And my talk as a whole will be kind of um, it'll be like a virtual tour of sorts. So we'll be uh, jaunting across the map of Britain virtually, um, and and I'll be telling stories. So I'll give you a hint, give you ideas, and some details about what happens to Arthur in certain places, what happens to the story, what are the events that are narrated for that place, and then we'll look at some pictures of the place, and then I'll talk a little bit about how some of the places become part of British identity historically, currently, and also become tourism spots as well. So some of the discussion will then be sort of what does this story mean now for people there or people visiting some of these places across Britain. And it'll be kind of, like I said, a virtual tour where there are 4 or 5 stops where we're going to get out and really explore the space and talk a lot about the stories. But then when we hop back on the bus, occasionally we'll sort of drive by a place, and I'll mention it as we drive by, but we won't stop. But we'll sort of see it out the window, and I'll talk a little bit about them. But there are about four or five places that I'm really focusing on, um, in part because they have either a strong identity with Arthur in the place, or because they have strong tourism. And as you'll see in some of the pictures, I have been an Arthurian tourist. Sadly, some of the pictures include me, so you'll get to see me on screen double a couple of times. Before we get into the actual spots, I want to show you this um, late medieval map of Britain for a couple of reasons. I want you to kind of have a sense of one way that people in the late medieval period thought about space, thought about maps. It's very different than how we think about maps. When I pick up a map, or when I open up my Google Maps on my phone these days, I'm expecting it to tell me how to get someplace, what's my route, what does it look like when I get there, for example. Maps in the medieval period didn't really do that. They weren't usually um, uh, helping you get someplace. They were more generalized spatializations, more generalized sense of how things relate to each other. Um, you'll see on this map of Britain that all of the locations that are marked as important are marked with either a castle or a cathedral, right? So that's a way that a town would distinguish itself, by having an important building, by having a castle, which means there's a town built around it, or a cathedral, which means it's an important religious center. Um, if you're at all familiar with Britain, or have seen it on a map, you might find that this one looks a little funny. The reason it looks funny is that it's um, south on top. So the southern part of Britain is at the top, and the north is at the bottom. Um, the north on top orientation is a relatively new way to look at the globe, to look at maps, um, for people in the northern hemisphere anyway. And many maps from the period, if they're world maps or what they knew of the world at that time, are sort of centered on the Holy Land, centered on Jerusalem. And so this kind of orients very vaguely towards that Holy Land. And here's just a little close up to get a sense of what some of these castles look like. Um, these are not what they actually look like. If you use this map and look at these images to try to find these places, it will fail miserably, because these are just sort of representations of what a castle can look like. And then here are some of the places that we'll be stopping on the map along the way. You'll see it is not the most economical of tours, as we will very briefly be going by the furthest place away, but it's one of my favorite places, so I wanted to show you anyway. Okay, so we'll be going kind of chronologically through Arthur's life. We're starting with before his life. So that means we're starting at Stonehenge. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Stonehenge. It's this ring of stones that's ancient. It's maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years old. We don't have a written record of its making. We don't know exactly how it was made. There's no good building evidence. The stones are 25 tons, I believe, and it's just hard to imagine how they were even put into place. And it's that mysteriousness, both sort of how did it get there, but also what was it for? Was it religious? Was it meant to be astronomical? Is it something of both? We do know before the stones were there, it was a burial ground too. So we know a little bit, but not much about it. I'm sure there are archaeologists who know a lot more than me, certainly. But because it's so strange and mysterious, it becomes a place that um, you can put a story on top of, right? And so that's what often happens with the Arthurian story, that the story is placed over a location that people would already know and would already have ideas about. And because it's so magnificent, even as a ruin, because it's so strange and mysterious, and because of its long history of importance, um, that's one of the reasons that the Arthur story started using it as part of their legend. So Merlin is the wizard or the magician, or in some versions more the scientist, who aids, assists, guides, advises Arthur and kings that come before him. His powers really shift depending on which version you're reading, but in one of the earliest, actually the earliest sort of full story of King Arthur, written by a man named Geoffrey of Monmouth, he writes a book that in English is translated as the History of Kings of Britain, which is really designed to tell all of the history of the kings of Britain. Some of the kings get like a paragraph or a page or maybe a couple of pages. King Arthur gets 3 chapters, so he gets pages on pages on pages, and even more than that if you count the sort of pre-story, including the building of Stonehenge. Um, so Merlin's connection to Stonehenge is the current king at that time, uh, fictitious king to be clear, uh, Aurelius Ambrosius, wanted to honor some heroes who had fallen in battle, and decided that this great stone monument that was already in existence in Ireland on this hill in Ireland would be the perfect way to celebrate um, their own heroes. And it was called, according to the legend, this is, we don't have any sort of real, this isn't real, this is just the Arthurian story, but it was called the Giant's Ring, and that was because years before Merlin's fictitious time, giants had come from Africa and had brought the stones to Ireland. And so King Aurelius wants Merlin to help procure those and bring them back to England to put them in place in order to be a monument. And he is tasked to do this, and um, he has a partner, and his partner is Uther, who later becomes king. He's the brother to the current king, and he's also, very importantly for our story, Arthur's father. Right, so they go to Ireland and they have to battle. They have to battle in order to sort of win the right to these stones, but that ends up being the easier part because it's really difficult to move these gigantic stones, right? So this is kind of a testament to how people in the time this story was being written, which is in the early 12th century, already recognized that, like, how do these stones get there? They're so hard to move. Um, and so Merlin kind of sends the workforce in there to move them, and they can't do anything. They have no ability to move them. And then he's able to do it based on his brains over his brawn. So it's not using physical strength; it's using mental strength and smarts. And we don't get a lot of details about it. It doesn't indicate sort of how he used his smart, just that he used his smart. So it remains mysterious, right? So even as they're um, making a story out of it and giving a reason for the Stonehenge's existence and explaining it, they're still not really explaining it because it's sort of that mystery that surrounds Merlin. Um, and you can see him there, the image from the manuscript of him sort of putting the headstones in place there. And let's see, you'll see here, this is a much more modern version of the story from the early 80s. And still the Stonehenge story being and Merlin being connected together in the Arthur story. So in this version, um, Arthur is brought back to life in the year 3000 because the world is in trouble. Tyrants are trying to take over, and he goes to Stonehenge to wake up his buddy Merlin for additional help, um, loudly, as you can see there. And so Stonehenge is still, of course, a place of great tourist interest. That tourist interest isn't entirely or even mostly Arthurian. I mean, there's so much interest in it for lots of reasons. But importantly, there is an annual solstice celebration this year. They did it virtually, I believe, but that's led by a man who calls himself Arthur Pendragon. So he's the head of a druid religious group, calls himself Arthur, connecting himself to the legend, connecting himself to Stonehenge as well, and they go there for the solstice, in part because it has this history of this astronomical history, and where the sun sort of comes through on the solstice proves that. Okay, so back in the bus, we're going to head down over to the coast to Tintagel. Tintagel is the location for Arthur's conception, so things are going to get a little bit risque here as we talk about Arthur's conception and birth. So as I said, this is on the coast. This is on the southwestern coast of Britain. Cornwall is the area. It's an area that was important really throughout all of British history that we can trace. For example, they've found artifacts there from the 5th century that show it as an international port. There are imported items there, and the fact that it was an important place in the 5th century makes it a reasonable location for King Arthur, whose time period likewise is that far back, right? This invented time period anyway. The castle, as you can see in these images, is now just a footprint of what it was. It's really in ruins. there are some walls that still stand, but you can get a sense of it, and you can get a sense of its really geographic awesomeness. It's just an amazing location because of where it is on the coast. Um, and as we'll see at the end, this is a place that has really gone headfirst and gone all in on Arthurian tourism. They're not fooling around in how they use the Arthurian legend, just leading to some debates about it, as I'll talk about a little bit. So, as I said, this is the location of Arthur's birth and his conception, which is the story I'll really be telling. Um, so, his father, King Uther, uh, falls in love or in lust, really, with one of his men's wives. So the Duke of Cornwall, his wife Igraine, really catches Uther's eye, and he just gets in almost all the versions. He just is immediately lovesick. It is love slash lust at first sight, and 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 it's just really powerful. And so he decides, as any king does, I guess, who's fallen in lust with one of his men's wives, that he's just going to throw a nice long party so he gets to hang out with her a lot, right? So he invites everyone there as ostensibly to celebrate. The versions vary a little bit. In some versions, they're celebrating a recent victory together. In some versions, they're celebrating having come together after having been um, at war with each other, actually. So in those versions, it's a really touchy moment because they're just kind of coming together, and then it gets even touchier when they have this party. And in most versions, Uther doesn't really do a very good job keeping it cool, right? So he's not really able to just kind of hang out with his buddy's wife and not really show that he's super into her. So in some versions, he just like keeps having food sent her way and only her way. In some versions, he has gifts sent to her that are clearly better than what he's doing for all the other people. In one version, he can't stop staring at her, right? So pretty quickly, it's clear um, that the reason they're there isn't to celebrate, that the reason they're there is for something that's not quite right. So either the Duke or Igraine, his wife, depending on the version, notices, I think we were brought here for something that we're really not that into, and we're getting out of here. This is not okay. And so they just leave. But this is a party that was supposed to be spread out over multiple days, and they leave without the permission of the king. So now not only is he lovesick for a woman he can't have, but he's also really, really mad that they just defied him, and it's embarrassing. I mean, you imagine you're the king, you're throwing a party, and people just leave without saying goodbye, right? So war is the only answer, right? That's what you do. Not really, don't do that. But when people leave your party early, what you do is war. And so the Duke of Cornwall secures his wife in the safest castle he owns, or it seems like must be the safest castle, which is Tintagel, because it's on the coast. It's misty, as you can see in these pictures, a lot of the time because of its coastal location. So it's kind of protected by the fog and the mist. Um, it's also like some of it's on the mainland and some of it's on a peninsula, as you can kind of get a hint of in the picture. And so there's one path to get there, so it's easy to defend. So it seems like it's the perfect place to put Igraine and to keep her safe, while they go to war like 10 or so miles away, at a castle that's sometimes called Castle Terrible. But while they're in this battle, while Uther and his troops, the king and his troops are uh, besieging this castle, he says, Igraine's alone. This is the perfect time for me to go see her. But how will I do that? I won't be able to get to her. So he brings in Merlin, and says, Merlin, you've got to help me out. And Merlin says, I can help you. One condition. In many, not all the versions, but in some of the versions, he has this condition that the fruits of the night that he will get to spend with Igraine belong to Merlin. So the firstborn child would belong to Merlin. And Uther's like, anything. I don't care. I'll do anything so I can get to spend the night with her. So what Merlin does is disguises him as the Duke. So he's able to just like walk right in the front door because everyone thinks it's just the Duke coming home. And he's able to walk right in to see his wife, um, and she thinks she's spending the evening with her husband, right? So how the magic work kind of varies. Sometimes there seems to be a potion. Sometimes there are herbs that are maybe rubbed on the face, or it's not always. Um, sometimes it doesn't really say. Just there's a disguise, and it happens. So Igraine assumes that she has spent the night with her husband, but in the morning she finds out that that was not possible because her husband had been killed the night before, right? So now she is in this panic. What have I done? Who was that? What's happening? Uther feels a little bit bad for like 14 seconds, but then he's like, "Ooh, I can marry her," and they do end up getting married. In some versions, he sort of relieves, in a way that's uncomfortable, certainly, but relieves some of her fears by telling her it was me, don't worry. But in some versions, he doesn't. In some versions, he actually uses the fact that she doesn't know to his advantage. In one version, he actually says, "You have to tell me everything," and she tells him, she's like, I don't know. I don't know whose child it is. I thought it was my husband, but he was dead. And Uther says, "Ooh, well, then seeing this child does not belong to us, we must give him away," right? So that's the excuse to have Arthur sort of shuttled off to be taken care of by Merlin and to be raised by a foster family is what ends up happening. Um, and so Arthur eventually, of course, as we'll see, and as you know, just from if you're here, you know that he becomes King Arthur, and eventually he's taken back into the royal family, but usually not until after Uther is has died himself, right? So Tintagel just really, really glommed on, really, really takes advantage of Arthur's birthplace, and this has been for years. It's long been a place that um, is attractive both to people who would want to uh, build there, for example, but especially in more recent years for tourism. Um, and so you'll see here, fairly recently, a statue has been built. That's the statue of Arthur that's called Gallos, which means power. Um, there's also a carving of Merlin that has been put into the stone. These both happened in the last four, I think they were 2016. And they've met with some resistance. Some people think it's kind of the Disneyification. And you can see as you look down the street too that King Arthur, I mean, it's the King Arthur's Arms, which is a tavern and an inn, and many other places that use the King Arthur name. And if you travel to Tintagel, I mean, there's just tour bus upon tour bus upon tour bus. If you go to the castle, there's at least the time I was there, um, the intro video is a King Arthur video. Um, a bunch of years ago, they found a burial stone that had just enough letters to think it might have actually been Arthur, right? Which of course doesn't mean anything in it, and it wasn't actually his name. But they're really always trying to sort of make this connection, and it's been really successful. It draws an off from a if you're pro tourism, I guess, but also gets a lot of people there, and that can have some environmental backlash as well. I mean, on the coast, it can be troubling, and there are an awful lot of people driving through some really really small roads too. Um, and it's often also been called Disneyified, so it's maybe a little bit too much on the tourism for some people's liking. Um, but it really speaks to this sort of desire for not just Arthur's origins, but sort of connecting British origins to Arthur's origins to make them sort of pair up a little bit. Um, okay, so now we're going to get back on the bus and swing quickly by St. Paul's. This is where, in at least one version anyway, Arthur pulls the sword from the stone. We're only swinging by because it's not even the same St. Paul's it was. This picture you see here is um, a rendering, a representation of the original St. Paul's, which burnt down in the fire of 1666, the Great Fire of London. Um, Here we see Arthur pulling the sword from the stone. This is how, in later medieval versions anyway, this is how he is proven to be the rightful king, often before they know that Uther is his father, including before he knows. Um, but but the Arthurian story isn't really part of St. Paul's uh, tourism picture. Their tourism is really religious and or architectural with the new building that went up in the late 17th century. So we're just gonna keep rolling by, not really going in an order that makes sense on the map, but moving along chronologically in Arthur's story anyway. Now we're going to stop at Winchester, which in Sir Thomas Malory's version, Le Mort d'Arthur, which means the death of Arthur, that's the latest really medieval English version of the story, and often sort of considered like the culmination of the medieval version of the Arthurian legend. It collects English and French versions and makes one big story arc from uh, the story of Uther and Igraine, which is what starts it, all the way to Arthur's death and then beyond a little bit as well. So in that version, Camelot, which is the Arthurian headquarters, is specifically associated with the city of Winchester. And the city of Winchester, yeah, I mean, it's part of the Arthurian story in many ways, regardless. But this is the only one that really connects it to Camelot. Um, Part of the reason is because there's an actual round table in Winchester, and that was there also when Mallory was writing. So that's probably part of why he's kind of already glomming onto tourism then, which is still a big part of what gets people to Winchester. You'll see in the picture that is the Great Hall for Winchester Castle. It's really the only part of the castle that still stands. The rest of it is in ruins or just gone beyond ruins. But you'll see there hanging on the wall is this gigantic round table. I mean, it is huge. Here's a close up. Um, you'll see around the middle there, it says that this is the round table of King Arthur, with his named knights there, and then around the edges are the names of the knights who are sort of metaphorically sitting at the table with him. But I mean, this table is enormous. So many more people could technically sit at this if it were laid out as a table. So this actual table was made in the late 13th century. King Edward I, who was a huge Arthurian enthusiast, wanted to have it to celebrate. Three of his children were getting married, so it was celebrating their engagements. And he was holding a tournament, and he had this sort of personal connection, identification with King Arthur. So he had this. The original version didn't look quite like this. Original version made for that event. It was hanging there, like I said, when Mallory is writing in the late 15th century, or it's there. The first printer of Mallory's work, also the first printer in England, the first person to be like doing printed copies of books as opposed to handwritten manuscripts. William Caxton, Mallory's text, Mordred Arthur, is one of the stories that he prints, and he even says in his preface to his Mort Arthur, he says, people have been asking me for this story, but other people say Arthur's not even real, so why should I tell the story? And he says, I know he must be real because we can see that round table at Winchester. Like, he points to that round table at Winchester as proof that there's this actual Arthur. And as we'll see, there are a couple of other things he also points to, other stops along our tour today. The current painting that you see was a repainting that happened in the 16th century. In 1522, King Henry VIII was welcoming the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V, I think it is, for an official state visit. So he repainted it on the center. You'll see the roses. Those are the Tudor roses that are Henry VIII is part of the Tudor family, so it's part of their family identity. And then the King Arthur picture, in that version, when it was repainted, like you see here, was in Henry VIII's own image. So he too is sort of identifying himself, identifying England with this King Arthur legend, right? So it gives, it's meant to sort of lend power, lend credence to various monarchs along the way. Both the round table idea, but especially King Arthur, certainly. And so it's now still, like I said, it's still hanging there in Winchester, and it still really draws in a lot of tourism. It's a big, again, a moneymaker and a thing that sort of drives the economy there in multiple ways. In the Arthurian stories, many of them, the round table as a physical object is part of the dowry that Guinevere, Queen Guinevere's father, includes when she is married off to Arthur, usually without her own say. She doesn't often have a say in the matter. But her father Leodegrance, grants to Arthur this round table, in one version because he doesn't need any land or he doesn't need money, but the round table is meaningful, and in addition, it has 100 knights that are attached to it. So it's a round table both in its idea that it's this collection of knights, but also as a physical table. It's supposed to hold 150 knights, then Arthur has to gather up another 50, which he has Merlin go off and do. And I don't have time to tell all of those stories, but it's there's some infighting about who should and who should not get a seat at the round table, because there are far more knights and only some of them get to be round table knights. And they fill it almost all the way. Of the 150 seats, they fill 148 there to start, and one of them stays empty for a really long time to be filled by Galahad, who will find the Grail. But we will not be doing any Grail hunting today, so we'll move quickly will travel super far north and also super far along the story. So we're skipping over many of the stories have just years and years of Arthur's success um, as a king. His legend just sort of continues to grow kind of globally within the story, right? And word of his power is getting out. In some versions, he conquers Rome, even in some he almost conquers Rome. Um, but there are lots of years in most of the versions where it's relatively peaceful. There are maybe small skirmishes, some sort of small individual tournaments and battles, but then the story usually ends with a schism in the Round Table community and it's usually connected to Guinevere maybe not being a faithful wife. So in the versions that include Lancelot, a well-known love triangle, Lancelot, Guinevere, and King Arthur. Lancelot's usually the best or one of the best knights, right? And um, often it seems that Arthur is uh, allowing allowing the love triangle a little bit because he's so fond of Lancelot because his own success is dependent on Lancelot. But in some versions, he's certainly not allowing it as well. Anyway, towards the end of the story, Lancelot and Guinevere get busted. Sometimes they're in the French versions, they're usually like really busted. In the English versions, they tend to kind of tiptoe around it and say things like, well, you can look in the French version to see what happens, but I don't really want to talk about it. But then everyone's mad at each other. So we have um, the round table kind of splits, not literally the table doesn't split in half, but the community of knights splits in half. Some people are on Arthur's side, some people are on Lancelot's side, and they go to battle. And they battle at a place called Joyous Gard, which in early versions is just sort of somewhere northeast in England. But Mallory specifically says, "Oh, it's either Alnwick or Bamborough. I can't remember which one." And those are both castles that he personally was involved in sieges at. So they're castles he was familiar with, and he's just kind of making out this connection to them. Bamborough, the castle on the lower right there, is which is absolutely my favorite castle, and it's just spectacular, and it's on this cliff. But it's kind of an unreasonable location for the story because a key element is um, Lancelot standing atop the walls having a conversation with Arthur below, and because it's on a cliff, like the distance just seems like it would be impossible to have that conversation. But anyway, back in the bus for a quick drive by of Tower of London, which um, has like some of the places we've seen, lots of reasons that people go to visit it. Has lots of history, both actual history and legendary history. Um, it has a number of Arthurian scenes that happen there, but one of the key ones is um, Guinevere fighting against Mordred. So in the schism that happens when Lancelot and uh, Guinevere are caught, he initially takes her with him to Joyous Gard, but then usually hands her back over to the king in an effort to make peace. But then peace, for various reasons, isn't really possible. And he's exiled and he's sent back to his lands in France. But King Arthur, in these versions, follows him to France in order to continue the fight, um, somewhat against his own will, but feeling beholden to it for a number of reasons. Um, Guinevere is left behind in England with Mordred, who's Arthur's son slash nephew, depending on the version, sometimes both. Um, little another risque story that I'll leave that out. Um, but Mordred decides, this is actually a good opportunity for me just to take everything. Like, I don't want to just be in charge for now while Arthur's gone. What I want to do is, I want to be the king. So he spreads rumors that Arthur has died in the battle against Lancelot in France, and he tells Guinevere, "Let's get married." She's actually not that into it. She doesn't want to marry him, but she doesn't have a lot of control. Um, but she's pretty smart, and she says in a number of the versions, "Okay, well, I need to go to London in order to buy stuff for my wedding. I need to do a little shopping." And so he lets her go, and she takes the Tower of London, which is the big castle in England, and she has her men and she holds up there and she defends it. She defends her body. She defends herself. To a degree, she's defending her husband's country. Um, and once Arthur hears about that, hears about Mordred taking over, hears about Guinevere. In some versions, she actually goes along with Mordred, but the later version, she's usually um, in love with Lancelot, and so it doesn't go along with it, maybe for that reason too. Um, but then Arthur comes back, and then we'll see that then there's full-blown war. So there was already the schism, but then it gets even worse as Mordred enters the picture. So the first place that Arthur and Mordred fight is at Dover Castle. So Dover is on the opposite coast from where Tintagel was, so it's on the southeastern coast. It's set high on the cliffs, the White Cliffs of Dover. Dover's really for all of Britain's, all of England's history, has been a really important spot because of its location. It's the like the closest spot across the channel to France, so it's not too far. There's ferry. Now there's not easy ferry crossing that you could just give a couple of bucks and take a ferry back in the medieval period, certainly, but um, it's a key place in most stories of Britain's military standing in the world. So also in the Arthurian story, um, Arthur wins that battle, but loses one of his great allies, Sir Gawain. There, Gawain is then buried, and although it's not really capitalized on now as a reason for tourism, Caxton, that first printer of Malory, points to Gawain's skull being at Dover as proof. He says you can go to Dover and see that skull, so Arthur must be real, right? So again, it's sort of connecting the land, the place, and the story as interwoven and creating meaning for each other. So Arthur wins. Mordred starts moving westward, trying to get away, trying to escape. Eventually, they meet in battle on Salisbury Plain, which is not too far from Stonehenge. Really, it's quite close to Stonehenge, and also close to where eventually Arthur is buried in Glastonbury. Also called Avalon in a lot of the stories as well. So when Arthur and Mordred battle, in some of the versions, they end up being like two of the very few people who are alive at the end, and they kill each other or almost kill each other. Mordred, usually we can say for sure, oh yeah, he's dead. Mordred's dead. Arthur often gets a mortal wound, but he doesn't die on screen per se, right? So he dies off screen. We see him sort of talking to his knights one last time. In a lot of versions, he needs his sword Excalibur to be returned to the lake, to the Lady of the Lake, and so he sends the knight to go bring it back. The knight often is kind of hesitant because it's such a beautiful sword and it's so powerful, and he doesn't necessarily want to get away. So sometimes it's 3 times before he'll throw it away. And meanwhile, Arthur is there in what's often been a really gory battle, and he's so close to death, but we don't see him die. Instead, he gets taken away on a ship um, by several women, sometimes including his sister or half sister, or um, Queen Morgan, who's his sometimes enemy, sometimes friend, and they take him off to heal him, but then he's sort of reported to have been buried at Glastonbury Abbey, right? So there are these two competing stories. Is he dead? Is he not dead? Has he gone to heal? Has he moved on to some other world? And this is part of how he often gets called the once and future king, right? So he's going to come back, right? He's just sort of on pause, is the idea that a lot of the stories indicate, and many authors from the medieval period really wrestle with this, right? Because it's such an important part of the legend for this English identity, to think about Arthur being ready to come back and help them when they need him. So there's this really positive side to it, but then there's also that's weird, right? So some writers from the medieval period are like, well, I don't know, like I haven't heard anything else about him except for this about the guy who says they think he was buried at Glastonbury, and I don't know, but other people say that he just sort of changed his life, and some people say this, and some people say he's going to come again, but I don't, some people don't really want to get into the weeds on what that means. Now at Glastonbury Abbey, they do want to get in the weeds, and in fact, in the year 1191, monks reported that they uncovered a tomb that really seemed like it must have been King Arthur. So this is 1191. They're claiming we have found the tomb of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. And they also find, on this next slide, you'll see the cross that is the tombstone. no longer in existence, to be clear, but we have some renderings of it from uh, and this is not the original rendering of it, but it's a replica of the original version of it, right? That it says, here lies buried King Arthur on the Isle of Avalon, so Avalon and Glastonbury kind of being put together, um, and they report this, right? They report that he was found. They move his body from this site outside to this site inside um, the cathedral or the abbey, Glastonbury Abbey, um, and it really becomes then in the late 12th century this tourism spot, right? This is really sometimes surprisingly common to see how much religious tourism there is because people would come on. I mean, sort of like pilgrimages a little bit. It's not one of the hottest of the pilgrimage spots, but people will come to see King Arthur's tomb, and there was an elaborate tomb at the time. And when they come, they'll donate some money to the abbey. So it becomes a, I mean, this is a really early version of tourism that happens there. You see the abbey is now in ruins. When King Henry VIII again broke with the Catholic Church and sort of brought the Reformation in an official capacity to England. Um, Eventually, the abbeys were many of them were dissolved, and some of them very literally dissolved, as you'll see here, um, intentionally ruined in order to mark sort of the end of the Catholic religion in favor of the Church of England, a Protestant religion, much later. So Avalon slash Glastonbury today sort of really continues to hold on to the legend and it's really expanded. They have multiple sort of points of connection to King Arthur and the King Arthur story. Um, so I'll talk a little bit about those, but also just about Glastonbury, there's this hill called Glastonbury Tor, um, that if you can kind of see in the picture that is a bit terraced, right? And it's hard to know, are those natural terraces? Are they were they man-made for farming purposes? It's mysterious. Glastonbury is also said to have interesting sort of magnetic field underneath it, so that sort of adds there are these multiple layers of spiritual uh, spirituality that are connected to it, multiple layers of mystery that are connected to it. And when you have mystery, like we had at Stonehenge, kind of coming full circle here, um, you have the opportunity to put a story on top of it, right? So if there's this magnetic field and people feel physically different because of it, it has this sense of spirituality, right? And so that's part of why, one of several reasons that Avalon is sometimes connected um, to Glastonbury. And the town, much like Tintagel, has really gone all in on it. They have, uh, I mean, you saw still they have the monuments there at the Abbey, but just like in Tintagel, the town has many inns. It has many pubs and stores that are dedicated to the Arthur story. But there are also other spots around town that continue to connect to the Arthurian story, even stretching way back before Arthur. Um, uh, it's according to the legends or some of the legends, Joseph of Arimathea who brings the Grail to England and he brings it to Glastonbury. And so there's a well, it's called the Chalice Well, and it has red water. And that red water is said to be because the Grail, which in some versions is the cup that was used for the Last Supper in the Christian tradition, and the cup that was also used to collect Jesus's blood, uh, it, at his crucifixion. So the Grail was brought there, and the well now has this red water because of that blood. Um, the science tells us that it's rusty water, really, that there's some iron oxide that's in there. But it seems really marvelous because there's this red water well, and then there's a clear water well really close to it. That's just not as deep. Again, the science sometimes explains it, but the legends are a little bit more fun. So they have the Chalice Well, they have his burial. They also Arthur's burial. They also have or did have. I don't think it's in existence anymore, but um, a hawthorn tree, the Glastonbury thorn, which Joseph of Arimathea reportedly like put a staff in the ground, and out of it grew this hawthorn tree, which, unlike most hawthorn trees, which would blossom once a year, would blossom twice a year. So it has this magical connection. And it was nurtured and grown for years, and it take bits off of it and make sure it sort of continued until fairly recently. Um, vandalism and other reasons people were continuing to cause problems. It had actually stopped the versions of it that have been grown in the past, even like 50 years, I think. But I'm not sure that they were double flowering anymore. Um, but not too long ago, the last one was removed. It had just been vandalized too many times. People trying to take those. So we have sort of this, positive identification where there's tourism, but there's also this sort of negative thing that it can bring some bad actors out trying to connect to that as well. Whether they're connecting in ways that they think are positive that they want a part of it, or if they're connecting in negative ways where they're just trying to destroy it isn't entirely clear because it's kind of a bit of an unsolved mystery to my knowledge anyway. So there we have kind of our quick tour of Arthur and his mapping across Britain and how that mapping kind of continues to happen and continues to evolve. I want to thank you all for joining me today.
All right. Well, thank you, Molly, for presenting. That was a great presentation. I loved all the pictures. I will probably never be able to make that trip, but it's always great to see, presentations like this where you can see all those historic areas. And that round table, that was amazing. So, um, thanks for joining us. If this makes you interested in reading about King Arthur, of course, we have books here about him. We also, I was just checking Hoopla and Libby. There's also ebooks on there to check out. You can contact us and we can help talk you through how to set up your account through Hoopla and Libby. So, yes, thanks for joining us. And of course, thank you, Molly, for presenting. So,
Thanks for having me.
all right.